On North Broad Street in Philadelphia, in a block of light industrial buildings that have housed printing firms and auto parts distributors and, briefly, a recording studio, there is a wall. Old brick, the kind Philadelphia builds from as automatically as other cities build from limestone or timber, showing the ghost of a painted sign that nobody has bothered to remove or fully repaint. The letters are gone, but the outline remains, a faint rectangular shadow where the paint adhered differently to the mortar. The building at that address was, from 1920 to 1924, a factory. It made, in its best years, perhaps 600 motorcycles annually. It employed somewhere between 30 and 60 workers, depending on the season. It produced, for 8 consecutive years, the fastest production motorcycle in the world. At its peak in 1922 and 1923, the Ace Motor Corporation built machines that weighed 365 pounds, ready to ride, displaced 77 cubic inches across 4 inline cylinders, and carried a stock top speed approaching 80 miles per hour. A hopped-up competition variant, the XP4, ran 129.61 miles per hour in 1923 under the rider Charles Red Wolverton, setting an American motorcycle land speed record so comprehensive that the company offered a cash prize and a silver trophy to anyone who could break it. The prize was never claimed. The trophy stayed on a shelf in a Philadelphia office. Nobody came close. The machine that produced these numbers was an inline 4-cylinder motorcycle in an era when the V-twin dominated American roads, when single-cylinder machines outnumbered 4s by 10 to 1. The Ace sat low and long, its wheelbase a compact 59 inches compared to the heavier machines of its rivals, its seat height 29 inches from the ground. The engine was an F-head design inlet over exhaust valves, the configuration William Henderson had refined through a decade of building Hendersons, and which he considered superior in every measurable way to the side valve layout that Ignaz Schwinn's engineers had imposed on his former motorcycle after buying his company. The Ace was Henderson's argument. The engine was his evidence. The sound, when you opened the throttle past half, was different from anything else on American roads. Not the hammering bark of a Harley-Davidson V-twin, not the single-cylinder thump of the cheaper machines that competed for the working-class market, but a layered, precise, 4-part mechanical harmony, 4 pistons in sequence, each one's power stroke beginning before the previous one had finished, creating a continuity of force that translated at the handlebars into something approaching smoothness. What riders reached for, finding no better comparison, was the automobile analogy. It sounded like a fine motorcar engine, designed rather than evolved. The 2-wheeled Duesenberg, someone said, and the description stuck. Then, the death of the man who designed it, on a Philadelphia street at 39 years old, the financial hemorrhage that no record-setting run could stop. The company that went bankrupt in 1924 and was sold for its tooling and its name, the absorption into Indian in 1927. The slow disappearance of everything that had made the Ace specifically, irreducibly the Ace. This is a story about how one man's second chance became a final statement, about how genius at the drawing board cannot substitute for capital in the bank, about a machine so precisely excellent that the world held the speed record it had set, unchallenged, for years while the company that built it lay in bankruptcy, its workers unpaid, its founder dead on a street he had been testing his own motorcycle on because he could not stop improving it. A man who could not stop designing. William G. Henderson turned 37 years old in November 1919, and he was, by the standards of any reasonable accounting, a man who had already done enough. He had founded a motorcycle company in Detroit in 1911. He had designed the first commercially successful inline 4-cylinder motorcycle in America. He had sold the company to Ignaz Schwinn's Excelsior Motor Manufacturing and Supply Company in 1917 for a price structured around the assessed value of the assets and the brothers' continued services, William, receiving $5,000 per year as factory superintendent, Tom receiving $10,000 as general sales manager, plus 200 shares of Excelsior stock held in trust. He had spent 2 more years working for Schwinn in Chicago as chief engineer of the consolidated operation. By any external measure, he had succeeded. By any internal measure, he had been defeated. The Henderson that Schwinn's engineers built after the sale was not the motorcycle William Henderson would have built. Schwinn wanted durability and police fleets, a machine that municipal maintenance departments could service without specialized training. The result was the Henderson Model K, introduced in 1920, heavier, equipped with the side valve engine configuration that Henderson specifically did not prefer, with forks and handlebars shared with the Excelsior series. The whole thing optimized for the institutional buyer rather than the performance enthusiast. The Model K was, by every commercial measure, correct. Schwinn sold it to police departments across the country and shipped it to Europe and Australia. He made money. William Henderson resigned in early 1920. He went to Philadelphia, where Max M. Sladkin, owner of the Haverford Cycle Company in the western suburbs, provided the capital that Henderson's ideas required. They incorporated the Ace Motor Corporation in the fall of 1919, and by the following year, they were building motorcycles on North Broad Street in a factory small enough that every worker knew every other worker by name. Henderson was building the machine he had always meant to build. The first Ace was announced in late 1919 for the 1920 model year, priced at $375. The Henderson Model K, its most direct competitor, sold for $395. For $20 less, the Ace buyer received a lighter machine, 365 pounds, to the Henderson's 430, with better acceleration, a smoother engine character at high revolutions, and the particular satisfaction of owning the machine that William Henderson had built after Ignaz Schwinn had told him what kind of machine to build. The city and the factory that made it. The workforce Henderson assembled on North Broad Street was small by the standards of his former employers. At Schwinn's Cortlandt Street facility in Chicago, the Henderson line alone employed dozens of machinists and assemblers. At Ace, the entire operation numbered perhaps 40 workers in its best periods, men from the machine trades who brought with them the specific knowledge that precision manufacturing required. A man named James T. Crowder, who worked on the Ace engine assembly bench from 1921 until the company's bankruptcy in 1924, described the operation in an interview gathered by Philadelphia industrial historian Thomas Brennan in the late 1960s. Everyone understood what they were building, he said. We could tell when something was right because we had learned what right felt like. Men built engines from component to completion. They knew the whole machine. The Ace engine was Henderson's rebuttal to everything Schwinn had done to his original design. Where the Model K's side valve configuration placed both intake and exhaust valves in the cylinder block, the Ace retained the F-head layout, intake valves in the cylinder head, operated by a rocker arm from the camshaft below, exhaust valves in the block. The arrangement was mechanically more complex and required more precise machining. It was also, in Henderson's view, more efficient, better combustion, freer breathing at higher revolutions, more response under a rider who wanted to push it. The difference in power output was real but modest. The difference in the engine's character was more significant. The initial working capital was less than $100,000, a thin margin for a manufacturing operation, especially one targeting the premium end of a market already narrowing, as the Ford Model T compressed automobile prices and eroded the motorcycle's economic rationale. Henderson knew this. He built for the enthusiast, for the sport rider, for the man who would choose a machine on the basis of what it did rather than what it cost. The cognoscenti understood the lineage. The Ace sold to a buyer who had followed the story of American four-cylinder motorcycles and wanted the original vision rather than the institutional compromise. The record that never fell. Irwin George Baker was 40 years old in September 1922, born near Lawrenceburg, Indiana, in March 1882, and he had been setting and breaking Transcontinental records since 1914. He had done it on Harleys. He had done it on Indians. He had accumulated more than 100 long-distance records across 2 wheels and 4 and the nickname Cannonball. His relationship with motorcycle manufacturers was professional and mercenary in the best sense. He was enormously valuable to whoever he rode for, and he knew it. When the Ace Motor Corporation approached him in 1922, Henderson needed something dramatic. His company was 3 years old. The machine's reputation among enthusiasts was strong, but its recognition among the broader public was limited. Baker could provide, in a single continental crossing, the kind of attention that no magazine advertisement could purchase. On the 23rd of September 1922, Baker started from Los Angeles aboard a stock Ace 4-cylinder motorcycle. 6 days, 22 hours, and 52 minutes after leaving, he arrived in New York City, having smashed the Transcontinental motorcycle record, a record held since 1917 by a Henderson. This was the story Henderson told every potential buyer. The record previously held by Henderson had been broken by Ace. The machine that William Henderson built after Excelsior compromised his original vision had beaten the machine that Excelsior built after acquiring that vision. It was marketing in the register of historical vindication. The XP4 demonstrated something more elemental. In 1923, Arthur O. Lemon, who had joined Ace as chief engineer after Henderson's death, coming from Excelsior, built a specialized machine designated Experimental 4. The engine displaced 1,200 cubic centimeters and weighed 285 pounds in race trim, stripped of everything the standard motorcycle carried that contributed to comfort rather than speed. The compression ratio was elevated beyond street-legal applications. The camshaft was reground for maximum lift. Charles Red Wolverton took the XP4 to the Philadelphia Speedway in 1923 and ran it through the timing equipment at 129.61 miles per hour. This was not a number that required context. It was the fastest speed any production-based motorcycle had ever achieved in America, by a margin substantial enough that Ace's management felt confident, offering a cash prize and a silver trophy to any challenger. Nobody challenged. Nobody came within 10 miles an hour. The record stood in the AMA books long after the company that set it had gone bankrupt, after the name had been sold to Indian, after everything except the number itself had been dispersed. 4 cylinders and what they meant. Take the 1,922 Ace apart on a workbench, and you are looking at a design that carries the accumulated thought of a man who had spent a decade refining a single fundamental idea. Henderson had begun designing 4-cylinder motorcycles in 1910, and by 1922, he had had 12 years to think about the Inline 4's specific engineering requirements. The Ace was his 4th iteration of an idea that had been improving continuously since the first Henderson prototype turned over in 1911. It was lighter than every previous design. It was faster. It was the best of the line. The engine displaced 77 cubic inches in the original configuration, 1,220 cubic centimeters across 4 cylinders of equal bore and stroke. Each cylinder cast individually in iron and bolted to a shared aluminum crankcase. The crankshaft ran on 3 main bearings, the throws positioned at 180-degree intervals so that cylinders 1 and 4 fired together, then 2 and 3, creating the even beat of a balanced inline 4. The primary drive went by chain to the clutch. The clutch drove a 3-speed hand-change transmission. The chain final drive was fully enclosed, reducing maintenance and keeping lubrication consistent across transcontinental distances. The weight was 365 pounds. This is where the Ace separated itself from the Henderson Model Ks, 430 pounds, a 5-pound advantage, nearly 15% of the Ace's total mass. The difference was felt in every aspect of the riding experience. The Ace accelerated faster from a stop. It steered more quickly. It changed direction with less effort. It felt more willing under a rider who pushed it into corners. It also felt more exposed to road irregularities that a heavier machine would smooth over with momentum. Riding the Ace required engagement. It did not smooth the road for you. It asked you to ride. Dick Winger, a Wisconsin-area motorcycle historian who rode an Ace extensively during a period when he was researching early American fours for an article published in Motorcycle Classics in the 1980s, described the throttle response as unlike any other inline four he had ridden before or since. "You open it, and the engine pulls immediately," he wrote. "Without the slight lag you expect from machines of this age and type, it doesn't feel antique. It feels deliberate." The 1920 Ace carried no front brake, an external contracting band brake on the rear wheel only, a limitation that subsequent models addressed but that the earliest machines carried without apology. The lack of a front brake was standard practice in the period. Road surfaces and typical speeds did not yet demand it. What the Ace's standard equipment did include was a cartridge-type internal coil spring in the front fork, giving meaningful suspension travel and a clean visual line, a detail that reflected Henderson's preference for engineering solutions that were also elegant solutions, where function and appearance were not in competition. The price was $375 for the 1920 model, rising slightly in subsequent years as materials costs increased. This placed the Ace above the cheaper V-twin machines that made up the bulk of the American market and essentially level with the Henderson Model K. The buyer who chose an Ace over a Henderson was not primarily making an economic decision. He was making a statement about what he valued: lighter and more willing over heavier and more durable. The original designer's vision over the institutional refinement, the machine that had its priorities in the right order, the officers who chose it and the men who built it. The American motorcycle market of the early 1920s was contracting from below as the Ford Model T compressed automobile prices toward the motorcycle's range, eroding the economic argument for two wheels as primary transportation. What remained was the enthusiast market, the rider who wanted a motorcycle for reasons unconnected to economic necessity, who read Motorcyclist magazine and followed the Transcontinental records and the hill climb results, who evaluated motorcycles with a seriousness that the casual buyer never applied. The Ace found its market here immediately. The trade press covered it from the first issue with genuine enthusiasm. Motorcyclist reviewed the 1920 Ace as smooth, fast, well-engineered, lighter than the Henderson it clearly descended from. The reviewers noted Henderson's hand in the design, which was both the machine's greatest marketing asset and a reminder that the man who had built the finest motorcycle of the previous decade had not stopped improving on his own work. Henderson and Sladkin organized a dealer network along the eastern seaboard with concentrated representation in Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Baltimore, where the enthusiast market was densest. The factory shipped machines as far west as Chicago, where the Ace competed directly against the Henderson that bore its designer's name and was built by 400 workers in a Cortlandt Street facility covering half a city block. The irony was not lost on anyone. William Henderson's Ace, built by 40 workers in a small North Broad Street factory, was competing for customers with Ignaz Schwinn's Henderson, built at the largest motorcycle factory in the world. The Ace was winning on performance. It was losing on volume. James T. Crowder, the engine assembler, described the final months of the company's operation in terms that captured the specific pathos of precision manufacturing in distress. "We knew it was coming," he told Brennan, "because the orders stop before the pay did. And when the orders stop, you know you are building toward a final inventory rather than a continuing production." The machinists who had worked alongside Henderson personally, who had handed him tools across the bench and taken the engine back when it needed another adjustment, knew that December 1922 had taken something the path company could not replace. They built the remaining machines well because they knew no other way. Then they went to find other work. The morning of December 11th. By the autumn of 1922, the Ace Motor Corporation had achieved something that most motorcycle startups of the period never achieved. It had survived long enough to matter. 3 years of production, a growing reputation, Cannonball Baker's Transcontinental record, the XP4 waiting in the shop for its speed run. Henderson had refined the design through several improvements, better carburation, an upgraded clutch, revised fork geometry, and the 1923 models represented the most fully developed version of his original vision. The order books were full. By any reasonable assessment, the worst was over. On the 11th of December 1922, shortly after 11 in the morning, William Henderson rode the prototype of a new model, the Ace Sporting Solo, a lighter and more performance-oriented variant out of the North Broad Street factory and onto Castor Road for a test session. He was 39 years old. He had been testing his own motorcycles on public roads since before the Henderson Motorcycle Company was incorporated. Testing was not a task he delegated. The engineer needed to feel what the machine did, not hear a second-hand account of it. A motor vehicle driven by a man named Elmer Fursich came out of Folkrod Street at speed and struck Henderson directly. He was taken to Frankfurt Hospital but never regained consciousness. He died that afternoon, the 11th of December 1922, at the age of 39, without knowing what would happen to the company or the machine he had spent 4 years building. The eulogies in the trade press were immediate and genuinely felt. Motorcyclists described him as America's pioneer 4-cylinder motorcycle designer and noted that the Ace would stand as his finest achievement. The AMA, through its affiliated publications, ran remembrances from riders and dealers who had followed his work from the first Henderson through the Ace. The AMA Hall of Fame citation, written decades later when Henderson was inducted in 1998, noted that those who worked alongside him described themselves as working with Henderson rather than for him, a quality of collegial respect that distinguished the North Broad Street factory from the more hierarchical manufacturing operations of the era. He was buried at Westwood Cemetery in Oberlin, Ohio. What the eulogies could not address was the question of what happened next. Henderson had been Ace, not merely its designer but its animator, the person whose presence in the factory convinced workers that what they were doing mattered, whose understanding of every component and every assembly operation gave the production process its specific quality. Max Sladkin was a businessman who understood the motorcycle market. He was not an engineer. And the Ace Motor Corporation had been built around the assumption that William Henderson would continue to be what he had always been, the engineer who inherited the debt. Arthur O. Lemon was 41 years old in 1923, and he carried the specific peculiarity of being simultaneously William Henderson's successor and his former institutional adversary. Lemon had worked for Henderson at the original Henderson Motorcycle Company as a salesman, had followed him to Excelsior after the sale, had become head of Henderson Engineering at Cortlandt Street, and had designed the side valve Model K that William Henderson had found so philosophically offensive that he resigned rather than see it into production. Lemon had also, in 1915, been the man who joined Henderson as his first dedicated sales representative. Back when the Detroit factory was small enough that the company's salesmen also helped with assembly during busy periods. The two men had worked closely together for years before institutional pressures put them on opposite sides of a design argument. Now, coming from Excelsior to Philadelphia after Henderson's death, Lemon brought engineering skills the company needed and the institutional memory of everything Henderson had tried to avoid. He also brought Charles "Red" Wolverton, the rider who would take the XP4 to 129.61 miles per hour. Wolverton was one of the best motorcycle racers in the country, a specialist in hill climbs and speed events, able to tell an engineer not merely that something felt wrong, but where it felt wrong and when. He became ACE's competition representative in the events that served as the primary arena for American motorcycles in the early 1920s, competing in Eastern States Championship hill climbs, where ACE needed to demonstrate that the design remained competitive after its founder's death. Lemon redesigned the frame with a downward slope toward the rear, lowering the center of gravity and improving handling. He upgraded the carburetor, strengthened the clutch, and built the XP4 that secured the brand's position as holder of the American speed record. These were competent improvements, not visionary ones. Lemon was a good engineer, working within the parameters of an existing design. He was not what Henderson had been, the man who saw in his mind what the next version should be and built toward that vision with the certainty of someone who had invented the thing in the first place. The financial position deteriorated through 1923 and into 1924. Record runs generated press coverage but not proportional sales. The production cost remained stubbornly higher than the margin available at retail. In the spring of 1924, Ace Motor Corporation ceased operation. The workers were let go. The tooling, the name, and the remaining inventory of parts were available to whoever wanted to buy them. What Indian bought and what it could not. The bankruptcy of 1924 was followed by a period of corporate fragmentation that is difficult to trace in clean chronological detail because the surviving documentation is incomplete. The name, the tooling, and the parts changed hands at least twice in the 2 years following. One owner, the Michigan Motors Corporation, resumed production for a period the exact duration uncertain, with estimates ranging from several months to approximately a year, producing machines functionally identical to the last Ace models. The final transfer came on the 27th of January 1927, when the Indian Motorcycle Company of Springfield, Massachusetts, purchased the remaining Ace assets' name, tooling, parts, and the services of Arthur Lemon. Indian paid a price that contemporary reports placed in the range of the assets' appraised value, which by 1927 was considerably less than what Sladkin had invested in the original operation. Indian wanted the Inline 4 motorcycle in its lineup. The Ace design, which had proven itself the finest expression of the format in American production, was the most direct path to that goal. The Indian Ace was marketed for the 1927 model year, sold from Springfield dealers to buyers who had followed the Ace story through its corporate convulsions and were willing to buy the machine under new ownership. In 1928, as Indian's engineers began integrating the four-cylinder design into their production infrastructure, the Ace name was discontinued and the motorcycle became the Indian 4. A 5-main bearing crankshaft eventually replaced the original 3-bearing design that had been a limitation at very high revolutions. The machine continued in production until 1942, when wartime aluminum restrictions ended it. Through 15 years of Indian production, the basic architecture of the engine William Henderson had designed in 1919 remained recognizable. The dimensions changed, the materials improved, the lubrication system was refined, but the fundamental arrangement, 4 cylinders in line, the crankshaft running the length of the frame, inlet over exhaust valves, was Henderson's arrangement, carried forward by an institution that had bought his work and found it too good to fundamentally change. What Indian brought was scale, capital, and the institutional stability the original company had never achieved. What it could not bring was William Henderson. The Indian 4 was, by every measurable standard, a better motorcycle than the 1920 Ace for daily use. More reliable, better finished, better supported by a national parts network, equipped with the increasingly sophisticated suspension and braking that the 1930s brought to the industry. It was not the same machine. The Ace Motor Corporation had one purpose. In October 1924, Fred Ludlow, a former Harley-Davidson and Indian rider, then working as a motorcycle police officer in South Pasadena, took a modified Henderson Deluxe to the Cajon Pass Highway in California and ran it at 127.1 miles per hour. He had not beaten the XP4's record. Despite Ludlow's mastery of the speed run and the full resources of whatever tuning a Henderson could tolerate, the Ace's mark stood. The trophy stayed on the shelf. Nobody came to collect it. Where the Ace lives now. The building on North Broad Street does not announce its history. The ghost sign has faded to the point where you have to know what you are looking at to see it at all. Philadelphia has had several generations of industrial tenants since 1924, and none found the previous occupant's story relevant to their own operations. The machines themselves are elsewhere, and they are not numerous. Fewer than 50 Aces built during the original 921,924 production period are believed to survive in any condition. The Barber Vintage Motorsports Museum in Birmingham, Alabama, holds one of the finest, a 1,922 example representing the machine at its mature production form. Visitors approach from the right side, where the 4 exhaust pipes emerge in their even row from the engine and sweep downward, where the crankcase can be seen in its full longitudinal length, where the Inline 4's architecture is immediately legible as something designed by a person who had been thinking about Inline 4s for 12 years and had run out of reasons to compromise. The National Motorcycle Museum in Anamosa, Iowa, holds a 1,923 example in unrestored condition, not stripped, but preserved in the state in which it arrived at the collection. The engine turns over. The frame is straight. The paint is the original dark blue that was Ace's standard color for most of its production run, faded where storage exposed it to light, intact in the shadows of the engine cases. This is what William Henderson built. The wear patterns are the wear of actual use. The minor repairs show where the original owner solved specific problems with specific solutions. An unrestored Ace in this condition tells you things about the machine's life that no restoration can. A fully restored Ace with documented provenance commands $80,000 to $120,000 at auction, depending on year and specific variant. The 1,923 examples representing Henderson's own design in his own factory are more sought after than the post-bankruptcy machines. The XP4, or a genuine XP4 component, would command considerably more, but no complete original XP4 has come to market in recent decades. The Indian 4, which carried the Ace's genetic material through 1,942, has its own collector community and market, separate from and larger than the Ace collector community. The Indian 4 is more common 15 years of Indian production versus 4 years of Ace, and is supported by a parts reproduction industry that the Ace market cannot sustain. It is also not the same machine. The Ace was built by 40 workers who had been assembled by William Henderson because Henderson needed to build the finest motorcycle in the world and could not stop himself from trying. The Indian 4 was built by the largest American motorcycle company. The difference is visible in the machines themselves, in ways that people who know both will point out immediately, and that people who know neither will sense without being able to name. The American Motorcycle Association's Hall of Fame inducted William G. Henderson in 1998, alongside his brother Thomas. The citation describes him as America's pioneer 4-cylinder motorcycle designer. It notes the Henderson Company and the Ace. It does not attempt to measure what was lost on Castor Road in December 1922 because there is no unit of measurement adequate to that calculation. The trophy that was never claimed. Return to the ghost sign on the brick wall. Return to the rectangular shadow on the mortar, the outline of an announcement that was made for 4 years and then stopped being made. The A-Speed trophy sat in a Philadelphia office through the bankruptcy, through the reorganization, through the Michigan Motors Corporation interregnum, and eventually disappeared with the remainder of the company's assets when Indian purchased everything in January 1927. No challenger ever came for it. The record stood in the AMA books until the development of machines that bore no relationship to anything that could reasonably be called a production motorcycle had pushed it aside. In the competitive environment of 1,923, no production motorcycle anywhere in the world came close to 129 miles per hour. The margin was not ambiguous. The pride in the machine was real and earned. Cannonball Baker's 6 days, 22 hours, and 52 minutes was not marketing.